When my husband told me I'd make everyone uncomfortable at his company's annual gala. I never imagined that his words would lead me to discover a secret that would change everything. I thought I knew about our 15-year marriage. What started as a simple disagreement about a dinner invitation became the thread that, when pulled, unraveled an entire web of lies, deception, and betrayal that had been carefully constructed right under my nose for months. I'm speaking to you from my home in Denver, Colorado, where the mountain air usually helps me think clearly. But on this particular evening in late October, nothing could clear the fog of confusion and hurt that had settled over my life. My name is Sarah, and I've been married to David for what I thought were 15 wonderful years. We met in college, built our careers together, bought our dream house with a view of the Rockies, and created what I believed was a solid, trusting partnership. But sometimes the people we think we know best are the ones hiding the biggest secrets. It all began 3 weeks ago when David came home from work with an elegant cream-colored envelope in his hand.
Oh.
The paper was thick, expensive, the kind you use for important occasions. As he handed it to me, there was something in his expression that I couldn't quite read, a tension around his eyes that I'd never noticed before. The invitation was for Morrison Industries' annual charity gala, the biggest event of the year for his company. David had been working there for 8 years as a senior project manager. And this was the first time he'd received an invitation to bring a guest to the gala. I was excited, honestly thrilled. In all his years at Morrison Industries, I'd only met a handful of his colleagues at casual barbecues or brief encounters at the grocery store. This felt like a milestone, a chance for me to finally be part of that important aspect of his life. I immediately started thinking about what I would wear, imagining the conversations we'd have with his coworkers, the stories I'd finally be able to put faces to. But when I looked up at David with a smile, ready to share my excitement, his expression stopped me cold.
Okay.
He was staring at the invitation in my hands with what I can only describe as panic. His face had gone pale, and he was running his hand through his hair the way he always did when he was nervous about something at work. When I asked him what was wrong, expecting maybe he was worried about the cost of a new dress or concerned about taking time off work, his response hit me like a physical blow. He said I would make everyone uncomfortable. Just like that, matter-of-factly, as if it were obvious. When I asked him what he meant, struggling to understand how my presence could possibly make anyone uncomfortable, he fumbled for explanations that made less and less sense. He said I wouldn't fit in with his colleagues, that I wouldn't understand their conversations about work projects and industry trends, that I might say something inappropriate without meaning to. The more he talked, the more confused and hurt I became. I'm not some sheltered person who's never been to a professional event. I have my own career as a marketing coordinator for a nonprofit organization. I've attended plenty of formal dinners and charity events. I know how to make small talk, how to be gracious and professional. The suggestion that I would somehow embarrass him or make his colleagues uncomfortable felt like a knife twisting in my chest. But what bothered me even more than his words was the way he was acting. David has always been confident, straightforward, the kind of person who says what he means and means what he says. This stammering, nervous version of my husband was someone I'd never seen before. His explanations kept changing, becoming more elaborate and less believable with each passing moment. First, it was about me not fitting in, then it was about the event being boring for someone outside the industry. Then it was about him wanting to focus on networking without worrying about entertaining me. I told him I understood if he preferred to go alone, that I didn't want to cause any problems for him at work. I genuinely meant it, even though I was deeply hurt. Marriage is about supporting each other. And if going alone was better for his career, I was willing to make that sacrifice. But instead of looking relieved or grateful, David looked even more uncomfortable. He took the invitation back from me quickly, almost snatching it, and said he'd figure out what to do. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling while David slept soundly beside me, trying to make sense of what had happened. In 15 years of marriage, David had never once suggested that I was anything other than an asset to him, socially or professionally. He'd always been proud to introduce me to new people, confident in my ability to handle myself in any situation. This sudden concern about me making people uncomfortable felt completely out of character. Over the next few days, I found myself paying closer attention to David's behavior. And I began to notice things that had probably been there all along, but that I'd somehow overlooked. He'd become secretive about his phone, taking calls in the other room and keeping his screen turned away from me when he was texting. He'd started working late more often, claiming urgent projects that required him to stay at the office until 8 or 9 at night. When I'd suggest bringing him dinner or stopping by to say hello, he'd quickly discourage me, saying the office was too chaotic or that his boss didn't like personal interruptions. Most telling of all was how he talked about work. David used to come home full of stories about his colleagues, frustrated by difficult clients, excited about successful projects. Cute. Lately, his work stories had become vague and generic. When I asked specific questions about the people he worked with or the projects he was handling, his answers were evasive, lacking the detail and enthusiasm that had always characterized his storytelling. A week after the invitation incident, I was at the grocery store when I ran into Janet Morrison, the wife of David's boss. Janet and I had met a few times at company barbecues, and she'd always been warm and friendly. When she saw me, her face lit up with excitement, and she immediately started talking about how wonderful it was that David was finally bringing me to the gala. My confusion must have shown on my face because Janet's expression shifted to concern. She asked if everything was all right, if there had been some miscommunication about the event. I managed to smile and give some vague response about still figuring out our schedules, but inside, my mind was racing. If Janet Morrison was excited about me attending the gala, if she saw it as David finally bringing me, rather than as an unusual or potentially uncomfortable situation, then what had David been so worried about? That evening, I decided to be direct, told David about running into Janet, and asked him to explain what was really going on. Why was he so concerned about me attending an event where the boss's wife was actually looking forward to seeing me? His response was another fumbling explanation about work dynamics and professional boundaries. But I could see the sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool October evening. It was then that I made a decision that would change everything. I told David that I'd made up my mind not to attend the gala, that I didn't want to cause him any stress or worry about work relationships. I could see the relief flood his face, and that relief told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't about me potentially making anyone uncomfortable. This was about David not wanting me there for reasons he couldn't or wouldn't explain. The next morning, after David left for work, I did something I'd never done in our entire marriage. I went through his things.
Okay.
I started with his home office, looking through papers and files, not sure what I was searching for, but knowing I'd recognize it when I found it. In his desk drawer, underneath some old bank statements, I found a small stack of receipts that made my blood run cold. Dinner receipts from restaurants I'd never been to, dating back several months. Movie tickets for films I'd never seen, purchased in pairs. Receipts for flowers that had never appeared in our house. Wine that had never graced our table. Receipt told a story of a life David was living without me, activities he was sharing with someone else. But it was the receipt from a jewelry store that really stopped me in my tracks. David had purchased a necklace just 2 weeks earlier, an expensive piece that cost more than we typically spend on anniversary or birthday gifts. I knew it wasn't for me because my birthday wasn't for months. Our anniversary had passed, and he hadn't given me any jewelry recently. This necklace was for someone else, someone important enough to warrant that kind of expense. My hands were shaking as I put the receipts back exactly where I'd found them. The evidence was circumstantial but damning. David was having an affair. The gala wasn't about me making anyone uncomfortable. It was about him not wanting his wife and his girlfriend in the same room. The thought made me nauseous, but it also made everything click into place. The secretive phone calls, the late nights at work, the evasive answers about his colleagues, the sudden concern about me attending work events. I spent the rest of the day in a strange state of calm that I now recognize as shock. I went through the motions of my normal routine, doing laundry, preparing dinner, responding to emails from work, all while this new reality settled into my consciousness. My husband of 15 years was cheating on me, and he'd been doing it for months, maybe longer. When David came home that evening, I watched him with new eyes. Every gesture, every word, every expression was filtered through this new knowledge. When he kissed me hello, I wondered if he'd kissed her goodbye. When he complained about his stressful day at work, I wondered if the stress was about managing his double life rather than actual work pressures. When he suggested we watch a movie together, I wondered if it was the same movie he'd seen with her the week before. The hardest part was pretending everything was normal. I made dinner. We ate together. We talked about mundane things like weekend plans and household repairs. But underneath the surface, I was planning. I needed to know who she was. I needed to understand how long this had been going on. And I needed to decide what I was going to do with this information. Over the next few days, I became a detective in my own life. I started paying attention to patterns in David's behavior, noting when he claimed to be working late, tracking his moods and reactions. I noticed that he was particularly distracted on Tuesday and Thursday evenings, often receiving texts that would make him smile before he quickly put his phone away. I noticed that he'd started being extra attentive to me on weekends, as if he was overcompensating for something. The breakthrough came when I was doing laundry and found a business card in David's shirt pocket. It was for a woman named Alina Rodriguez, who worked in the marketing department at Morrison Industries. On the back of the card, in what was clearly David's handwriting, was a phone number different from the one printed on the front, along with the notation personal, Alina Rodriguez. Stared at that name, turning it over in my mind. I'd heard David mention her before, always in passing, always in the context of work projects and marketing campaigns. She was the person who handled promotional materials for major client presentations. She'd been part of the team that worked on the campaign that had earned David a significant bonus 6 months earlier. But I'd never heard him describe her in personal terms. Never heard him mention spending time with her outside of work contexts. I found myself curious about this woman who had apparently captured my husband's attention. What did she look like? What was she like to talk to?
What?
She have that I didn't. These questions consumed me, but I also felt a strange sense of detachment. As if I were researching characters in a novel rather than the people who were destroying my real life. That weekend, I made an excuse about meeting a friend for coffee, and instead drove to Morrison Industries. I knew David was at home working in the yard, so I felt safe exploring the area around his workplace. The building was mostly empty on Saturday, but there were a few cars in the parking lot, probably people catching up on work or attending weekend meetings. I sat in my car across the street, feeling slightly ridiculous, but unable to stop myself. I needed to see her, to put a face to the name that had been haunting my thoughts. After about an hour, I saw a woman emerge from the building. She was tall, with long dark hair and an elegant way of carrying herself. She was dressed casually, in jeans and a sweater. But there was something polished about her appearance that spoke of careful attention to style and grooming. I watched her walk to a silver sedan, and as she passed under a streetlight, I got a clear look at her face. She was beautiful, but not in an obvious or flashy way. She had classic features, warm eyes, and the kind of smile that seemed genuine and approachable. Looking at her, I could understand the attraction. She seemed like the kind of person who would be easy to talk to, easy to fall for. I drove home. I felt a complex mix of emotions. I was angry, of course, furious at David for betraying our marriage and lying to me for months. But I was also strangely curious about Alina. What was her perspective on this situation? Did she know David was married? Was she in love with him? Or was this just a casual affair for her? Did she feel guilty about the deception? Or had David convinced her that our marriage was already over? The more I thought about it, the more I realized that Alina might be as much a victim in this situation as I was. If David had lied to me about working late and business trips and the reasons he didn't want me at the gala, what lies had he told her about our marriage? Had he painted me as a distant, uncaring wife? Had he suggested that we were already separated or planning to divorce? The David I knew was capable of elaborate deceptions, as I was learning, and I wondered how deep his dishonesty ran. That realization sparked an idea that felt both crazy and completely logical. What if I reached out to Alina directly? What if, instead of confronting David with accusations and demands for explanations that would probably just result in more lies, I went straight to the source? What if I found out exactly what David had told her about our marriage and our life? Together? The annual gala was now just 1 week away, and I knew David was planning to attend alone, probably with Alina as his secret date. The invitation was still sitting on his dresser, a constant reminder of the event that had started this whole revelation. Looking at that cream-colored paper, I made a decision that surprised even me. I was going to give Alina the invitation, not as a confrontation or a dramatic gesture, but as a genuine offer. If David wanted to take someone to the gala, if he wanted to share that important work event with the woman he was apparently in love with, then he should be honest about it. And Alina deserved to know exactly what she was getting into. I spent several days crafting my approach. I didn't want to ambush Alina at work or show up at her home unannounced. I wanted to give her the choice of how to handle this information, the same choice I wished someone had given me months ago when this affair was beginning. Finally, I decided to write her a letter. The letter took me 3 drafts to get right. I wanted to be honest without being accusatory, direct without being cruel. I explained who I was, how I'd discovered the affair, and what I'd observed about David's behavior over the past few weeks. I told her about the gala invitation and David's reluctance to have me attend. Most importantly, I asked her what David had told her about our marriage and whether she'd known that he was still very much married and living with his wife. I ended the letter by including the gala invitation and explaining that if David wanted to take her to this important work event, she should know that she deserved to go as his honest date, not as his secret companion while his wife sat at home, believing she was protecting his professional reputation. I told her that whatever she decided to do with this information was entirely up to her, but that I thought she deserved to know the truth about the situation she'd become involved in. Getting Elena's home address required some creative research. I looked her up on social media, cross-referenced her information with public records, and finally located her apartment complex. It was a nice place, the kind of building where young professionals live when they're starting to establish themselves but haven't yet settled into permanent life choices. Standing outside her building with the letter in my hand, I felt a surreal sense of purpose mixed with absolute terror. I slipped the letter under her door on a Thursday evening. Knowing from my observations of David's patterns that Thursday was one of their regular meeting days, I wanted her to have time to process the information before she saw David again. Time to decide how she wanted to handle this revelation. Then I went home and waited. David came home late that Thursday night, as expected, with the same distracted happiness he'd been displaying on his Alina evenings. He was unusually affectionate, bringing me flowers and suggesting we plan a weekend getaway. At the time, I interpreted this as guilt-driven overcompensation. But now I wonder if Alina had already received my letter, and if their evening together had been more complicated than usual. Friday passed normally, but I could sense an undercurrent of tension in David that hadn't been there before. He seemed jumpy, checking his phone more frequently than usual. And he kept starting conversations that he didn't seem able to finish. When I asked if everything was all right at work, he assured me that everything was fine, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. Saturday morning brought the confrontation I'd been both dreading and anticipating. David came into the kitchen where I was making coffee, holding his phone with an expression I'd never seen before. It was a mixture of confusion, anger, and something that might have been fear. He asked me if I'd contacted Alina Rodriguez. The directness of the question surprised me. I'd expected him to continue the charade, to keep pretending that nothing was happening, to maintain the elaborate fiction he'd been constructing for months. Instead, he was asking me outright about Alina, using her name, acknowledging her existence in our marriage for the first time. I told him yes, I had contacted her. I explained about finding the receipts, about discovering the business card, about realizing that his reluctance to take me to the gala was about protecting his affair rather than protecting me from social discomfort. I told him about the letter I'd written and the invitation I'd included. David's reaction was not what I expected. Instead of anger or defensiveness or attempts at justification, he looked defeated. He sat down at the kitchen table and put his head in his hands, and for several minutes, neither of us spoke. When he finally looked up at me, his eyes were red with tears I'd rarely seen from him in our 15 years together. He told me he was sorry. Not sorry he'd been caught, but sorry he'd hurt me. Sorry he'd lied. Sorry he'd let the situation become so complicated and painful. He said he'd never meant for any of this to happen, that it had started as a friendship and evolved into something more before he realized what was happening. He said he'd been trying to figure out how to handle the situation without destroying our marriage, but that he'd been cowardly and selfish in his approach. Most importantly, it told me about his conversation with Alina the night before. She had called him after receiving my letter, and they'd met to discuss what she'd learned. According to David, Alina had been horrified to discover the extent of his deception. He'd told her that our marriage was struggling, that we were considering separation, that I was aware of their relationship and didn't mind. All lies. As she now realized, Alina had told David that she couldn't continue their relationship under these circumstances. She'd believed she was involved with a man who was honestly ending his marriage, not sneaking around behind his wife's proposal. Back. She'd felt used and manipulated, and she'd told David that she deserved better than to be part of such a deceptive situation. As David recounted this conversation, I found myself feeling an unexpected sense of connection to Alina. She'd reacted exactly as I would have hoped, with integrity and self-respect. She'd refused to continue being part of a lie, even though it meant ending a relationship she'd apparently cared about. But what happened next surprised both David and me. Alina had decided to attend the gala, not as David's date, but as herself. As a Morrison Industries employee who had received an invitation from the wife of a colleague, Koo thought she deserved to understand exactly what kind of situation she'd been drawn into. Alina had told David that she was going to the gala to represent herself honestly, to attend as a single professional woman rather than as someone's secret affair. David was panicked about this development. He begged me to intervene, to contact Alina again and ask her not to attend. He was terrified about what people at work would think, about how the situation would reflect on his professional reputation. The irony wasn't lost on me that he was now worried about exactly the kind of social discomfort he'd originally claimed I would cause. But I refused to contact Alina again, given her the information she deserved to have, and what she chose to do with it was entirely her decision. If she wanted to attend the gala, she had every right to do so. If David was uncomfortable with that prospect, he could choose not to attend himself. The gala was that Saturday evening, and as the day progressed, the tension in our house became almost unbearable. David alternated between trying to convince me to help him manage the situation and trying to convince himself that everything would be fine. That Alina would change her mind, that somehow this whole mess would resolve itself without consequences. I, meanwhile, found myself getting dressed for an evening I hadn't planned to attend. If Alina was going to be there as herself, honestly and openly, then I decided I should be there too. Not to cause drama or create a scene, but to support a woman who'd found herself in an impossible situation and had chosen to handle it with dignity. I put on the dress I'd originally planned to wear to the gala, did my hair and makeup carefully, and walked into the living room where David was sitting on the couch in his suit, staring at his phone. When he saw me, his face went white. He asked what I was doing, and I told him I'd decided to attend the gala after all. I explained that if Alina was going to be there representing herself honestly, then I wanted to be there representing myself honestly too. I wanted David's colleagues to meet his wife of 15 years, not just hear whatever version of me he'd been presenting in his stories. The ride to the hotel where the gala was being held was silent except for the GPS directions. David kept glancing at me as if he wanted to say something, but no words came. I think we both understood that we were heading towards some kind of reckoning. A moment where all the lies and deceptions of the past few months would finally be exposed to the light. The gala was elegant. Exactly the kind of event I'd imagined. When I first saw the invitation, the hotel ballroom was decorated with autumn flowers and twinkling lights, and the attendees were dressed in their finest attire. As we walked in, I could see David scanning the room, looking for Alina, dreading the moment when the three of us would inevitably be in the same space. I spotted her first. She was standing near the silent auction tables, examining the donated items with what appeared to be genuine interest. She was wearing a simple but elegant black dress and minimal jewelry. She looked beautiful, but more than that, she looked comfortable with herself, confident in her decision to be there. When Alina noticed us approaching, her posture straightened slightly, but she didn't look away or try to avoid the encounter. Instead, she walked toward us with the same calm dignity she'd apparently shown throughout this entire situation. The conversation that followed was surreal in its civility. Alina introduced herself to me properly, thanked me for the letter and the invitation, and apologized for the role she'd unknowingly played in hurting our marriage. She explained that she'd believed David's stories about our relationship being essentially over, and that discovering the truth had been as shocking to her as David's affair had been to me. Most remarkably, Alina and I found ourselves having a genuine conversation while David stood beside us, looking like he wanted to disappear. We talked about our work, our interests, our perspectives on honesty and relationships. She was exactly as I'd imagined from watching her that day outside the office building. Intelligent, thoughtful, and genuinely kind. As the evening progressed, something unexpected happened. Alina and I continued to talk, finding common ground and shared experiences, while David became increasingly isolated. His colleagues kept approaching to meet me, expressing surprise and pleasure at finally getting to spend time with David's wife. Several people mentioned that they'd been looking forward to meeting me for years, that David talked about me often but had never brought me to work events. Janet Morrison was particularly warm, telling me how glad she was that David had finally decided to include me in these gatherings. She mentioned that she'd always wondered why I never attended company functions, and that she was delighted to discover I was as lovely as David always claimed. These conversations were eye-opening in ways I hadn't expected. It became clear that David's colleagues didn't see me as someone who would make them uncomfortable. If anything, they were puzzled by my absence from previous events and genuinely pleased to meet me. David's concerns about my attendance had been entirely fabricated, probably as much to convince himself as to convince me. As the evening wound down, Alina approached me one final time. She thanked me again for giving her the information she needed to make informed decisions about her life. She told me that she respected the way I'd handled the situation, that she'd learned something important about the kind of person she wanted to be and the kind of relationships she wanted to have. Most significantly, she told me that she'd realized David wasn't the person she'd thought he was. The man she'd been attracted to was someone who'd seemed honest and straightforward. Someone who'd appeared to be handling a difficult marriage situation with maturity and integrity. Discovering that he was actually capable of elaborate deception and manipulation had changed her feelings completely. Alina left the gala that night with her dignity intact and her future uncompromised. She'd faced an uncomfortable situation with grace and honesty, and she'd made choices that allowed her to respect herself and move forward without regret. David and I drove home in silence, but it was a different kind of silence than the trip there. This wasn't the silence of dread and anticipation, but the silence of people who've just witnessed something significant and need time to process what they've experienced. Over the following days, David and I began the difficult process of deciding what to do with our marriage. The affair was over. That much was clear. Lena had made it obvious that she had no interest in continuing a relationship built on lies and deception. But the damage to our trust and communication was extensive, and it would take months of honest conversation and professional counseling to determine whether our marriage could survive such a fundamental betrayal. What I learned from this experience went far beyond the obvious lessons about trust and communication in marriage. I learned something important about the power of choosing honesty over drama, directness over manipulation. When I discovered David's affair, I could have chosen to confront him with accusations and ultimatums. I could have created a scene at his workplace or tried to expose Alina publicly. Instead, I chose to give Alina the information she needed to make her own informed decisions. Treated her as an intelligent adult who deserved to know the truth about the situation she'd become involved in. That choice led to an outcome that protected everyone's dignity while ensuring that the truth finally came to light. Ellen's response to learning the truth taught me something about integrity and self-respect. She could have chosen to continue the affair despite knowing about David's deception. She could have rationalized that his lies weren't her responsibility, that she was only accountable for her own actions. Instead, she chose to remove herself from a situation that compromised her values, even though it meant giving up a relationship. She'd cared about David's reaction to being caught, taught me something about the nature of deception and guilt.
Oh man.
His relief when everything was finally exposed was almost as powerful as his initial panic. Living with such elaborate lies had been exhausting for him. And part of his emotional response was simply the relief of no longer having to maintain such complex deceptions. The reactions of David's colleagues taught me something about the stories we tell ourselves and the assumptions we make about other people's perceptions. David had convinced himself that I would be unwelcome at work events. But this belief was based entirely on his own guilt and anxiety rather than any actual feedback from his coworkers. His colleagues were genuinely pleased to meet me and puzzled by my long absence from company gatherings. Most importantly, this experience taught me about the difference between secrecy and privacy, between protecting someone and deceiving them. David had claimed he was protecting me from social discomfort, but he was actually protecting himself from the consequences of his choices. Real protection involves honesty and respect, not manipulation and control. 6 months have passed since the gala, and David and I are still working on our marriage. Some days are better than others. We're in counseling, learning how to rebuild trust and communicate more honestly with each other. David has had to confront the reality of his capacity for deception, not just toward me, but toward Alina as well. He's had to acknowledge that his actions hurt multiple people and that good intentions don't excuse harmful behavior. I've had to confront my own role in allowing our marriage to reach a point where such deception was possible. Not because I caused David's affair. But because I'd stopped paying attention to warning signs and had allowed us to drift into patterns of superficial communication and emotional distance, Alina left Morrison Industries 3 months after the gala. She'd found a better position with another company. But I suspect the decision was also motivated by a desire to remove herself completely from the situation that had caused so much pain. I respect her choice and hope she's found the kind of honest relationship she deserves. Looking back on that October evening when David first handed me the gala invitation, I'm struck by how one moment of discomfort and confusion led to such significant revelations and changes. If I'd simply accepted David's explanation about making people uncomfortable, if I'd agreed to stay home without questioning his reasoning, how much longer would the deception have continued? How much more damage would have been done to all of our lives? Sometimes the most important moments in our lives are the ones that initially seem small and manageable. A wedding invitation, a casual comment, a moment of unexpected discomfort that makes us pay attention to something we'd been overlooking. The key is being willing to trust our instincts when something doesn't feel right. Even when the people we love are telling us our concerns are unfounded. As I sit here in my Colorado home, looking out at the mountains that have always helped me think clearly, I'm grateful for the courage I found to pursue the truth, even when it was painful. I'm grateful for Elena's integrity and grace under pressure. I'm even grateful for the difficult lessons David and I are learning about honesty and trust in marriage. If you've stayed with me through this entire story, if you've listened to every detail of how a simple dinner invitation revealed such complex deceptions and ultimately led to such important truths, then you understand the power of paying attention to our instincts and having the courage to seek honest answers to difficult questions. These kinds of stories matter because they remind us that we all deserve relationships built on truth and respect, and that sometimes the most loving thing we can do is refuse to participate in comfortable lies. Hope my experience encourages you to trust your own instincts when something in your life doesn't feel right, to choose honest communication over comfortable avoidance, and to remember that everyone involved in difficult situations deserves to make informed decisions about their own lives. If this story resonated with you, if it made you think about the importance of honesty and integrity in your own relationships, I'd love for you to subscribe and join me for more conversations about the complex realities of modern life and love.